Chapter 62, in which damning allegations are made against a six-time Wimbledon champion. "Where'd your half pants go?" Garland said, as I climbed into the driver's seat of, depending on who you ask, our second or third stolen car. "Left them in the room," I said, a bit overwhelmed at the amount of buttons and knobs on the car's dash. "Good call," he said, and I turned and raised an eyebrow at his less than flattering dress. "If you enjoy having a full set of teeth, you might want to keep your comments to yourself," Garland growled, and I raised my hands in surrender. "Good," he said. "Now drive. Drive casual. We don't need any added attention." "What does driving casual look like?" I asked, backing out of the parking space. "I don't know, son. Just don't squeal the tires or anything else stupid. Now drive. I'll tell you when to turn." Garland kept us on back roads because there'd be roadblocks on the main roads in and out of St. Lo, and after 30 minutes, we reached the A84 motorway south of town. I put the pedal down. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, Steve McQueen," Garland shouted. "They've got traffic cameras all over these highways. Go the damn speed limit." "Why'd you steal a Porsche if we weren't going to drive fast?" I asked. "Because I had a Porsche once, but lost it to Billie Jean King in a charity tennis match." He must have saw me roll my eyes because he said, "You can watch it on your YouTube, son, and I've got proof she paid off the chair umpire. Hell, I can't even hear Philadelphia Freedom anymore without wanting to puke." The old man spent the next 10 minutes cursing Billie Jean King before presenting me with an exhaustive list of all the professional tennis players he'd had romantic entanglements with and or lost cars to. It wasn't exactly what I wanted to hear. I'll never look at Maria Sharapova the same way again. But as long as he kept talking, I could put off telling him that Madeleine was dead. Thankfully, the rhythmic bump of the motorway put him to sleep just after he regaled me with an overly detailed account of his weekend in Cabo with the Williams sisters. I took the Cannes bypass to the A13 motorway back to Paris, and for an hour I was alone with my thoughts. In particular, thoughts about, 1, Parker, and how she'd broken my heart under the guise of performing a karmic good deed. I mean, sure, I wasn't necessarily happy before this trip, but I did have an idea of Sadie to hold on to. It wasn't the real Sadie, but at least it gave me a reason for hope, because, 2, now when I thought of Sadie, I could only think about how Parker was right about her all along, which somehow made me pissed off at both of them. Luckily, when I'd get almost too angry to drive straight, I could always think about 3, Garland, and how he was still wearing a floral dress, and how I needed to snap a picture of him before he woke up. The old man stirred when I stopped for gas at a service area outside of Paris, and while I filled up the car and bought him a cup of coffee, Garland took the opportunity to change out of his dress. We pulled back onto the motorway, and I asked, "Can you tell me what happened to St. Lo after D-Day? How'd you and Madeleine get separated?" Garland took a sip of his coffee and said, "The Allies didn't reach St. Lo until 6 weeks after D-Day. They had a hell of a fight in those damned hedgerows. The Nazis pulled back, but kept hitting the Americans and the town with their big guns. Thankfully, by then there wasn't a soul left in St. Lo. Finally, on July 17th, the 29th Infantry Division rolled into town, and the men from St. Lo trudged back from the fields and farms to meet their liberators and inspect the ruins. I hobbled back with them, but Maddie stayed behind. She hadn't been the same since the bombing. There'd been moments of lucidity, but then she'd go right back to staring at the walls. It was shock, of course, but what could we do for her on a damn farm? I'm going back to town, I told her, but she didn't say anything, so I kissed her head and walked away. Was that the last time you saw her? I asked. Son, who's telling the damn story? Garland snapped, and I laughed and apologized. We walked back to St. Lo, but St. Lo wasn't there. The quiet little town I'd snuck into 3 months before was gone, bombed off the map. A few empty shells of buildings were still standing, and there were some with only 1 or 2 walls, but most of the town was piles of rock and dust. Only Notre Dame Church resembled itself. One tower had fallen, and the roof was gone, but compared to the rest of the city, it looked okay. They'd placed an American officer killed in the hedgerows underneath a flag atop the rubble outside the church, and many of the men from town stopped to pay their respects. I made my way to where Maddie's house had been. It was just a pile of rocks and wood. I kicked some of the rubble around, not really looking for anything in particular, just something I could take back to Maddie, and I found that ugly-ass painting she'd hung in the hidden bedroom. I stuck it in my backpack and stumbled over to where a couple American soldiers were standing. When I walked up, I overheard one say to the other, "We sure liberated the hell out of this place." I punched him in the jaw and knocked him out cold, then turned to his buddy and said, "I need to speak to your commanding officer." He looked down at his friend, then back at me, and pointed toward some tents on the bank of the Veer. I limped over and stepped inside the tent, and an officer said, "Can I help you, son?" Now you gotta remember, son, I'm wearing Maddie's dad's old clothes, and I'd been wearing them for weeks, so you can imagine how rough I looked. "I can imagine you in just about anything now," I said, and Garland stuck his middle finger in my face. I told him, "My name is Lieutenant Garland Lennox. A German Focke-Wulf 190 shot me down over St. Lo on April 24th, and I've been in hiding with—" And then the pain in my leg and the smell of the burning buildings and the sight of the rubble finally took their toll. I passed out right there in the tent. I woke up 3 days later in England. Turns out my leg needed surgery, so they sedated me and put me on a boat full of injured soldiers crossing back over the channel. I came to a few hours after surgery, and when they told me where I was, I went insane, pulled out my IV and knocked over every table I could reach, and screamed at anyone who'd listen that I had to get back to St. Lo, back to Maddie. It took the 4 biggest men I'd ever seen to hold me down and sedate me again, and when I woke up the next day, the process repeated itself. The next time I woke up, I tried a little tact, but they weren't letting me go back to St. Lo. Hell, they'd never let me fly again. There were rules for evaders. Pilots shot down but not captured by the enemy. We couldn't enter enemy territory again because if the Germans ever did capture us, we'd put resistance groups at risk. So I asked for some paper, to write Maddie a letter, and this young doctor came in and sat down next to my bed and told me she'd died. I don't know if he just assumed she died because she was in St. Lo, or if it was mistaken identity, or if they just told me that so I wouldn't try and sneak out and swim the channel back to France. Hell, I don't guess I'll ever know now. But that's what they told me, and I had no reason not to believe it. I spent a couple weeks recovering in England. Then they put me on a boat home. For a while I thought they'd send me to fight in the Pacific, but they never did. I spent the rest of the war in Montgomery, at Maxwell Field. Garland, I'm so sorry. It's all right, son. And hell, I can't say I didn't live an interesting life. They only wanted single men for my job, guys with no attachments. If I hadn't met Maddie, I might have married someone else and lived that picket-fenced American dream. But when you meet the one, you know it, and you know there ain't no use looking anymore. We were quiet for a few minutes after that, and then my phone rang. It was Fitz. I better answer this, I said.